It's nice to see the number of attendees growing as the minutes pass. Well, as the hour has just turned to 6 p.m., I think we will get started with introductions. I'm sure that there are more folks who will join us as we go along, but welcome to all who are here and all who will join us. My name is Randa Duvik. I'm professor of French at Valparaiso University and president of VU's chapter of Phi Beta Kappa, the National Honor Society. I'm joined this evening by Professor Tiffany Kolba, Associate Professor of Mathematics and Statistics, who is our Vice President of our VU chapter, and of course by our speaker this evening, Father Columba Stewart. A few nuts and bolts before we hear from Father Columba, though I've gotten used to running Zoom classes this year. This is my first time running a Zoom webinar, so I would ask your indulgence for any technological glitches that might occur, and I know there are many folks who can help out. We are keeping our fingers crossed, confident that all will go smoothly. We are recording this webinar. We will make it available through YouTube. And the link, when it is ready, will be available on our Valpo Phi Beta Kappa chapter webpage. And the URL for that is valpo.edu/phi-beta-kappa. So PHI-BETA-KAPPA. In an in-person talk, of course, we would leave time for questions at the end of the presentation, and we plan to do that here as well. Just type your question using the Q&A tool that is at the bottom of your Zoom window. And at the end of the presentation, Professor Kolba will be reading those questions so everyone can hear them. And then, of course, we will hear the answer from Father Columba. A couple of notes of gratitude as we start. Of course, we're thankful to the National Phi Beta Kappa organization for sponsoring the Visiting Scholar Program, which allows internationally known scholars like Father Columba to spend significant amounts of time with students and faculty at a number of different colleges. We are naturally also grateful to Father Columba for being part of that program and for being with us. And for our local arrangements, thanks to Professor Kolba for being our visiting scholar liaison, and to Dean John Kilpin in the College of Arts and Sciences for financial support. Father Columba was supposed to be here in person a year ago, but then the pandemic got in the way. So we're delighted that he's here with us, albeit virtually a year later. As part of the Visiting Scholar program, he's also making appearances in several classes in theology, English, French, and Christ College to interact with VU students, and of course, to deliver this public lecture this evening. So let me introduce him a little more specifically. Father Columbus Stewart is professor of theology at St. John's University in Collegeville, Minnesota, and he is executive director of the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library at St. John's. His academic training began at Harvard as an undergraduate and continued in graduate school at Yale and Oxford. Along the way, importantly, he became a Benedictine monk, entering the novitiate in 1981, and was ordained to the priesthood in 1990. He is a scholar of early Christianity, has authored 3 scholarly books, and has twice been a research fellow of the National Endowment for the Humanities. In 2019, he delivered the NEH Jefferson Lecture in the Humanities, which is the highest award of its kind bestowed by the federal government. Though there are obviously many fields about which Father Columba could speak to us today, he will in fact be talking about, as he puts it, saving the world's manuscript heritage from imminent danger. This project is headquartered at the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library and is truly an international project aimed at making it possible to pass on the heritage and knowledge that are contained in these manuscripts from many religious traditions. We welcome Father Columbus Stewart.
Thank you very much, Professor Duvik, for that introduction, and Professor Kolbe also for your hospitality in arranging this visit. I'm very glad to be with you this evening. So my goal is multi-part. I want to tell you a little bit about how manuscripts actually function and signify, and how that can happen within a particular scholarly project. So I am going to tell you just a little bit about the kind of thing I do in my own research so that I can set up the rest of the presentation, which will focus on the work of the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library, or as we call it, Himmel. And with the German Benedictine roots of our monastery, of course, we like the pun between the acronym and heaven, because the collection of manuscripts that we have is a scholar's version of heaven. So now I'm going to switch over to an actual presentation with images, and I've actually got a little video that I'll show you a bit later. So let's start our journey. So I begin with a manuscript and the ways that we as scholars can be drawn into manuscripts and the incredible discoveries that we find there. Now, this is going to be a little esoteric. I promise things are going to get a little more accessible as we go. But let me give you an example of the way I've used manuscripts in my own work. So what you're looking at on the screen is a manuscript written in Syriac, which is a Christian form of Aramaic, Aramaic being the language of Jesus and of the ancient Near East generally. Syriac has its own alphabet, which you see here, written from right to left, just like Hebrew is. And I've gotten very interested in various aspects of Syriac Christian tradition, and especially the question of what Greek works, like early Christian Greek theologians, monastic writers, and so on, did they translate from Greek to Syriac, and which did they not, and then why? So an example of one who was not translated is this theologian called Origen. And Origen was a 3rd century philosopher and theologian from Alexandria in Egypt, a great Hellenistic city. He wrote in Greek. He was brilliant, arguably the most creative theological mind of the entire Christian tradition. So we'll knock out both Thomas Aquinas and Luther. So we'll set both of them aside and we'll just go with Origen, at least I would argue as being the most creative. Now, Origen, although he's fundamental to the Greek theology that came after him, is not somebody who was translated into Syriac, because by the time they were translating all those Greek works, Origen fell under certain clouds of suspicion, because this theology was quite bold in the 3rd century and was thought to be too bold by the standards of the 4th and 5th. So his works survive in their original language, some of them only in Latin translation, but none of them were translated into Syriac, although many of the theologians and writers who depended on his thought were translated. Okay, so I asked the question, is Origen actually quoted anywhere in the Syriac manuscript tradition? And it turns out there is one place, And the place he's quoted is in a collection of little introductory paragraphs about the book of Psalms, which was used in many different Syriac Bibles as a kind of intro or preface to the Psalter, the book of Psalms. And there's a fairly extensive quotation of Origen writing on the Psalms. So that's really interesting. So I thought, well, how did this get into Syriac, even though those other writings didn't? So that took me to this manuscript, which is a Greek manuscript now at Oxford, which is the original Greek collection of these little commentaries on every verse of the Psalms, and indeed the rest of the Bible. This particular text survives in a single manuscript, and you're looking at it right here, of the 9th to 11th centuries, although it was probably actually originally composed in the 6th century. And somebody took that little introductory section before the verse by verse commentary on the Psalms, translated that into Syriac, put it in that tradition as an introduction to the book of Psalms, and it turns up actually in a lot of manuscripts, far more common than the Greek original was, which survived in this single one that you see here. Now, that manuscript that I showed you initially, this one, now in the British Library, 7th or 8th century, was actually written in Mesopotamia, in the Syriac heartland. And so there you see it, ancient Edessa, which is where Syriac actually became a written language. It was written there in the 7th or 8th century. We know it was taken to Egypt in the 10th century because they established a Syriac-speaking monastery in the Egyptian desert, because that was thought to be the real center of Christian monasticism. And there it lay until the 19th century, when the British Museum, now the British Library for the books, went shopping in the Middle East and collected Syriac and Armenian and Greek and Arabic manuscripts and took them all back to London, just like the Vatican did, just like the French did. And that's why it sits in London today, which is where I read it. Now, this manuscript itself had quite a journey. You can see Mesopotamia to Egypt, Egypt to London. But it also has a very interesting feature on one of its folios. So this is the actual text of the Psalms, not the thing that I started working on in the preface. And if you flip through the manuscript, remembering that every manuscript is unique, every manuscript has marks showing who owned it, who wrote it, experiences of people who read it, because these were not throwaway books. These were treasured, valuable compendia of wisdom. And if you go to folio 29, the back side, you find in the margin a little bit of Latin. And if you look more closely, it's a Latin translation of the same psalm you have on the left in Syriac, written in Latin script of the 12th century. In other words, it was written while the manuscript was in Egypt. So wow, how did that happen? Was this a chaplain with the Crusaders passing through Egypt on the way to the Holy Land? Was it an individual religious, a friar or monk from the West who wanted to visit this ancient monastic desert in Egypt and then left a little mark in the manuscript? We don't actually know. But what it points out to us is that manuscripts and the ideas that they contain traveled in the ancient and medieval world. And a way to illustrate this is to look at the famous medieval travelers. Benjamin of Tudela, who is a Jewish traveler, and you see him in blue wandering all over the place. Marco Polo, the very famous Western Christian traveler, wandered all across Asia and back. Ibn Battuta, the Muslim scholar, you see him in green, wandering all over what at that time was the growing Islamic world. And everywhere they went, they carried texts with them. They collected texts that they found there, and they brought them home. And so I've sometimes said that a way to think about manuscripts in the pre-modern period, before the invention of printing, is that in a way, manuscripts were the original Internet of Things. They were all somehow connected by the ideas contained in them, the influences of one text upon another, the way they followed these pathways of trade and exploration. Now, most of the manuscripts that we know well in North America, in Europe, that talk about cultures in places like the Middle East, Africa, and Asia are the manuscripts collected, like my manuscript now in London, during the colonial and imperial era. And here's a great example in a wonderful frontispiece to a book about Syriac manuscripts written by the first Vatican librarian. And there you see him down below pointing toward a crate of manuscripts that he, a Lebanese Maronite Catholic priest, had collected in the Middle East, in both what we think of as the Middle East, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, as well as in Egypt, in that particular monastery. And he took things back to Rome, to the Vatican, just like the British Library's agents took things to London. And our whole view of that part of the world has been shaped by the well-known manuscripts in Western libraries, which poses the question, what did they not get? And how would our understanding of these cultures and traditions be more well-rounded, something closer to 360 degrees, if we could find the manuscripts that they did not take to Europe during that era? So with that in mind, we have to think about famous other hunters of manuscripts and people interested in preserving them. One of the immediate inspirations for the work of Himmel is the pioneering manuscript work of a Benedictine monk from the 17th and 18th century, whose name is Jean Mabillon, one of the most important people you've probably never heard of. He was a member of the Marist Benedictine congregation, which was a kind of reforming, post-Reformation French Benedictine community that was trying to get monasticism sort of pulled together and back on its feet after the decadence of the Middle Ages and the shock of the Reformation. Jean Mabillon had a particular interest in recovering manuscripts of early Christian and medieval writings, knowing that manuscripts were starting to disappear because they were now using printing to circulate knowledge. And people were neglecting manuscripts, throwing them out, burning them because they were thought to be old-fashioned and useless. And Mabillon and the other monks of his congregation went around Europe, visiting churches and monasteries and individuals, collecting or copying the manuscripts that they had. They took them all back to Paris, to their monastery at Saint-Germain-des-Prés. And some of you who know Paris have been in the church of that monastery, which is all that remains of it. And there they started comparing manuscripts, figuring out the science of the writing in manuscripts so that you could figure out where a manuscript was written and when it was written just by looking at the style of the writing. In other words, the science of what we call paleography. And they produced massive and beautiful printed critical editions of all of those early Christian and medieval texts that they feared would disappear. In the modern era, there were people like Agnes Smith-Lewis and her sister Margaret Gibson Dunlop, the so-called Sisters of Sinai. So they were women who grew up together. They learned languages. They belonged to a wealthy and well-traveled family. And they devoted their prime, even in their married life, which I think for both of them was fairly temporary. The husbands conveniently exited, allowing them to get on with their scholarship. And they went around the Middle East, again, photographing this time with glass plates and collecting manuscripts that they used as the basis of important editions. So Agnes Smith-Lewis is really a pioneer of the photographic preservation of manuscripts, which has become the modern way of doing the kind of thing Jean Mabillon was doing in copying by hand and printing. Another example is the fantastic Peshitta microfilm project. The Peshitta is the most common Syriac translation of the Bible. It's the one that sort of became standard in Syriac Christianity. And that little Psalter preface that I talked about earlier with that section of origin was also used for this version of the Syriac Psalms. And it had been used for another one in the London manuscript I showed you. I needed to see this manuscript, which has now disappeared. It was originally came from the town of Diyarbakir in southeastern Turkey. It was taken to Mosul and then Baghdad, where the Patriarchate of the Chaldean Catholic Church was. And it's one of the manuscripts that disappeared around 2003 at the time of the invasion of Iraq, perhaps heavily damaged and destroyed because of some things that happened and all of the chaos, perhaps stolen, we don't know. All we have of it is the microfilm. And I can tell you from experience, it is not easy to try to read this manuscript from the microfilm, but it's a lot better than nothing. And this is all we have. And the photograph itself is a kind of a beautiful sort of presentation of manuscript and the arm of the person holding it. But as I say, it's not really ideal for scholarship. And you realize that they were having to improvise, because when they photographed the spine of the manuscript, you can see that they were propping all these up against a whiskey case. So this is field work under difficult conditions. So all of this lay behind the inspiration of Himmel. And our founder, Father Oliver Kapsner, is the one who had the idea in the 1960s to start a project that would microfilm Benedictine manuscripts in Austria initially, because in those days, the Cold War, there was real anxiety there would be a hot war, a nuclear war between the Soviet Union and the Western NATO powers. And Austria was in a particularly unique situation because it was a neutral country. It didn't side either with the communist bloc or with the NATO bloc. And for Benedictines, it was also important because it was the only country in Europe where monasteries kept their manuscripts. No Reformation, no French Revolution, no nationalist government taking over church property. And so his idea was to go there while we could and microfilm the manuscripts before they were destroyed in war. So this is how it unfolded. Started in '65 with that original vision. Already in the 1970s, there was an invitation to work in Ethiopia with a very different Christian tradition. Since 2003, our focus has been largely with Eastern Christian libraries in the Middle East, India, more recently in Egypt. And since 2012, we've expanded our work to include Islamic manuscript collections in the Holy City of Jerusalem, as well as in other centers of Muslim culture. And since 2016, we've been able to put all of these online, and I'll say more about that later. So you see how the project develops. The original mobile microfilming studio and that fantastic VW bus that some of us remember from our childhood, which was often depicted in the 1960s with a surfboard hanging out the back as people headed off to California to start anew. We used it to carry microfilm equipment. So you could set it up in a monastery like you see on the right and do a kind of industrial scale microfilming of the medieval manuscripts you see stacked up waiting to be microfilmed. We discovered something very important in the work that we did in Ethiopia, that project in the 1970s. You see at the top of the screen a manuscript that was microfilmed in Ethiopia in 1979. It's a very important 14th or 15th century manuscript of certain apocryphal biblical books, which we don't count either in the Protestant or the Catholic Bibles, but that the Ethiopian Orthodox Church does consider to be part of their Bible. Very interesting Jewish writings, which didn't really make the cut for the Western churches, but were prized by Eastern ones. This manuscript is no longer in Ethiopia. It's now in a private collection in Oslo, which means in the chaos of the Ethiopian Revolution, which started right after our project began, and then the communist dictatorship and the civil war, which is still having effects now in the recent conflicts in Ethiopia, this manuscript was taken out of the country by a smuggler, put onto the Western market, and sold for a very considerable sum of money. So we've learned that it's important to photograph manuscripts, not just because they might be destroyed, but because they might disappear. into a private collection. So what do? Simply, we partner with libraries to digitize, archive, and share their manuscripts. These days, we don't work in Europe very much because they don't need us. They have technology, they have money, they have the European Union supporting this kind of work. So instead, we tend to focus on regions where manuscripts are at risk. There's some kind of conflict, there's some economic pressure, which puts manuscripts at risk because of the black market that I was just describing, or the storage conditions are terrible because of poverty and the manuscripts are simply degrading, or other cases where very important manuscripts are not accessible because they aren't sitting in libraries that we think of where you go and you register and they give you permission to consult a manuscript. They're locked away in churches or monasteries, which are not open to visitors. We provide equipment, training, and payment for the people who actually do the work. So bringing skills and income to the local community. They handle their own manuscripts. And then our promise is to safely archive and share the images online, and then to provide tools for research so that people can learn how to read these. And along the way, we've learned, we can help track the changing status of collections as they move around, as they disappear, as they are sadly destroyed. So simple plot, we photograph every manuscript in a library. We don't cherry pick. We don't decide now what people in the future may find interesting. If it's a handwritten book, no matter how recent, we digitize it. We like to cover regions so that we have a fairly comprehensive view, not just a library here and there. We like to cross religious and linguistic boundaries within a region, because often you're in parts of the world which have several different religious groups and linguistic groups in the same place. This is what the world was like until the modern national era. And we'd like to do as much as we can across those boundaries to get a more complete picture of the intellectual culture of the region. And then we follow texts and manuscripts along their pathways of transmission. Where did these particular traditions go? Syriac Christianity from Mesopotamia goes all the way to India. It goes across the Silk Road. We want to follow that. So we work in places like this. Europe, not so much Western Europe anymore. A lot of work in Eastern Europe. Middle East has been a major concentration, working in Iraq and Syria before their most recent upticks of violence and conflict, working in Africa with both Christian and Muslim communities. South Asia, the same, Christians, Muslim communities in India, Nepal, and Pakistan. And it looks like we have a Hindu project on the horizon as well. So if we think back to the great medieval travelers and we think about what Himmel's doing, this was my pre-COVID typical year. So heading from Minneapolis, that's MSP, those of us who travel a lot know places by their airport codes, and crossing Europe, going to South Asia, working in Africa extensively to cultivate the relationships with the communities with whom we work. That's the overview. Now we do the travelogue. So I'm going to start our tour with the Syriac tradition as it exists in several modern countries, all of which were at one time part of ancient Mesopotamia, between the rivers, the cradle of civilization, which is the heartland of this Semitic Aramaic Christian tradition. And you find manuscripts there, despite the fact that the Christian communities are a shadow of their former selves. Most of the Christians have left for Europe, those who did not convert to Islam along the way somewhere. But you have small communities remaining in places like Diyarbakir, which is a real center for Kurdish nationalism in a kind of slow burn against the Turkish government. And in a church in Diyarbakir is a 6th century Syriac manuscript of the Gospels with this extraordinary portrait of Christ at the beginning of it. Total treasure, absolutely inaccessible, except for the photographs. Not far away is the Church of Mardin, which is an ancient town, used to be up on top, in that sort of natural fortress of rock. Below, you see the modern city, which was a real center of Islamic learning. and is the home to a very small remnant of a once flourishing Christian community. The Christians were severely reduced in numbers in persecutions in the 19th century, and then around the time of the famous Armenian genocide, which included a Syriac genocide in the same region. But there's still a church which has a priest in Mardin, and there you see him. He's the only priest left. There are three churches there belonging to different denominations. And on Sundays, he rotates, going from one to the other to celebrate the liturgy. And all the Christians, whatever their church, gather with him, because that's the way to keep the gospel alive. In the attic of his church, you have incredible Syriac manuscripts like this one, a 13th century gospel book. This is actually the Gospel of John with the Pentecost story on top. So this is what you can do with liturgy. You don't have to be slavishly consistent with lining up the narrative with the image. And this is a magnificent example of manuscript illumination, as well as a very beautiful example of Syriac handwriting. So all of the manuscripts in that region, Christian manuscripts, have now been digitized. So they are safe, even as they deal with a host of challenges, as has been the case in Syria. We started working in Aleppo in Syria in 2005. Aleppo on the Silk Road, ancient city of commerce, home at one time to a very significant Jewish community, several different Christian communities, and of course, after the coming of Islam, a very important center for the Muslim community. The Umayyad Mosque of the 8th century, a gem of Islamic architecture. And Aleppo became a refuge during the persecutions in Turkey that I was just describing. And here you see refugees coming from Edessa, that cradle of Syriac civilization, who came to Aleppo in 1923, carrying all of their manuscripts as they abandoned the city, which was the birthplace of their own Christian tradition, because they could no longer live there. They came to Aleppo and they built the refugee camp you see behind them. Among the manuscripts in their possession was the sole unique copy in Syriac of a very important world history or chronicle by a Syriac Orthodox patriarch named Michael the Great, Mikhail Rabo. Now, he was a 12th century person. He wrote his chronicle describing the events of the Crusades from the perspective of Middle Eastern Christians who were punished by their Muslim rulers because of the intervention of their fellow Christians from Europe. This manuscript was actually written in 1598. We don't have an older copy. This is the only complete copy in Syriac, the original language, and it contains the description of the punishment of Christians in Edessa by their Muslim ruler when the Crusaders showed up. And so the Christians were forbidden to ring their church bells because of what had happened with the foreigners, a story that, of course, sadly continues in the Middle East. Aleppo, we know, of course, was devastated in the Syrian civil war. 2011 is when that started. We were still working there. A lot of destruction fairly early on, including massive damage to the mosque. The minaret is the pile of rubble on the right. And the human toll was tremendous, including the loss of our partner in Aleppo, the Syriac Orthodox bishop, who, along with his Greek Orthodox counterpart, was kidnapped in April of 2013 and never heard from again. Probably a kind of botched kidnapping attempt, but a remarkable man who's the one who allowed us to digitize that manuscript I just told you about. So this takes us to Iraq. We all know the story of 2003, the American-led invasion, which deposed Saddam Hussein, and then the later troubles after the rise of ISIS. We've done a lot of work with Iraqi partners in northern Iraq in the so-called Nineveh Triangle, which you see there. And there you find a very interesting indigenous East Syriac Christian tradition with a living artistic tradition of its own, as you see in this 18th century manuscript of the story of Thomas, who would not believe that Christ was risen until he could touch the wounds in his hands and side. This is the gospel reading we had, in fact, just yesterday. And you see this very interesting treatment of it by a local artist, which looks sort of folky, but it's actually quite sophisticated, almost like seeing Matisse interpret the story. In Iraq, we've partnered with an Iraqi Dominican friar, Father Najib Mikhail, who is now Archbishop of Mosul. And there you see us standing above the plain of Nineveh, remembering that Mosul in Iraq is ancient Nineveh, the city of the prophet Jonah. In 2014, a couple of years after that particular visit, ISIS captured Mosul and then came east, sweeping through the Christian villages of the Nineveh Triangle. People had a couple of hours to grab everything that they had and take it with them to refuge in Erbil, the capital of the Kurdish region of northern Iraq. When ISIS took over, they did their best to destroy everything that they did not consider to be religiously acceptable. Pre-Christian monuments such as ancient Nimrud, which was destroyed with barrel bombs and bulldozers. You can see the Assyrian sculpture on the panel there. The shrine of Mar Behnam, a very venerated Christian saint, along with his sister Mort Sarah, which was videoed as it was destroyed with explosives by ISIS, and then distributed through their social media channels. Highly sophisticated techniques. The monastery of Mar Behnam was defaced. They removed all of the carvings of animals and people. They left their ISIS monogram, defacing a monastery which I had visited before. And these are photographs I took shortly after it was liberated in 2017. This is Mosul University Library, a modern library, very important, typical university library, one of the best in the Middle East. ISIS had burned the books, and then American aircraft destroyed the building. And so this is the devastation left behind. The Dominicans, their priory in Karakosh, I used to see in the upstairs room, again, was completely trashed, graffiti, fire. And that's where we did our work. Their own library of the Dominicans with things like dictionaries and encyclopedias, a kind of working theological library, reduced to ashes. And in the midst of all of that destruction, we found a little scrap from the digitizing studio that was there, which had to be abandoned in 2014. This is the sheet where you write the information about a manuscript that you then digitize. And we just found this sitting there, just like it had been the day that they had to leave. Good news coming out of Iraq, the manuscripts were able to be recovered from Mar Behnam, though not from other places, where they are either still missing or known to be destroyed. The monks hid them behind a false wall just inside the gate of the monastery, and the ISIS occupiers never found them. And so Christmas 2016, just when this was liberated, they brought the manuscripts out, and we were delighted to see them. We've also worked in Jerusalem. I just want to give you an example of what I meant by working across religious boundaries in a particular region. This is the old city of Jerusalem. Some of you may have been there. You've all seen photographs. And those red X's in names are Christian and Muslim libraries, family libraries, where we worked in the old city. All of them within 100, 200 yards of each other, all of them very close to the very explosive Temple Mount or Haram al-Sharif. And our goal was to preserve the intellectual culture of Jerusalem while we could. Now, one last travel stop in a place that has become important to us and important to me, and that is the West African nation of Mali, which is one of these creations really of the colonial era, taking very different sorts of geographical regions, peoples, ethnicities, and so on, to make a modern country. If you wipe out the modern borders and look at it from a medieval perspective, you see that the fabled city of Timbuktu was a very important stop on the trade route, which was moving gold, slaves, fabrics, and salt from Africa up to the Mediterranean coast in northern Africa and then off to the Middle East. And Timbuktu itself became not only a center of trade and power, but a center of learning. All of this made possible by the Niger River, which flows through Mali, taking what would otherwise be a largely desert land and making it able to sustain life. And this is a photograph taken in the capital of Bamako, Timbuktu up to the north. This is also a place with a very distinctive architectural tradition of Islamic architecture, using local mud bricks and then finishing the outside with a kind of stucco-like mud finish. Here's a mosque in San. I actually took this photograph last month. Here's an example of a famous mosque in Timbuktu. So Timbuktu, at one time a center of learning, now a place that travelers want to go just so they can say they've been there. Although Timbuktu has suffered terribly over the last 9 or so years, because it was occupied in 2012 by a group of what the locals call jihadists, who were both kind of people rising up for ethnic separatist reasons and also a very purist form of Islam. And there were early reports after French paratroops liberated Timbuktu in 2013 that the manuscripts had been destroyed. And you saw pictures like this, manuscripts on the floor, ashes. But it turned out that, in fact, most of them have been saved. And they have been saved by this man, Abdul Qadir Haidara, who's our partner, who had the sense, as local people often do, that something was coming. He just felt something in the air. And so he evacuated as many manuscripts as he could from Timbuktu, using metal boxes like this, which are locally made, on boats, sending them up the Niger from Timbuktu to Bamako, the capital, where I first saw them in December of 2013, shortly after the liberation of the town. 1,400 metal boxes packed with manuscripts, sitting in the humid climate of the capital, having come from the desert. So we signed an agreement with Abdul Qadir, which every year we renew, to work our way through what is well over 200,000 manuscripts. We trained people starting in 2014, and here you see the digitization studio as it has evolved. And by the way, the colorful dress is what they wear every day. This isn't like special ethnic garb. This is part of the fabulous living culture of Mali. And so the manuscripts one by one are being digitized with the kind of setup that you see here, all done by local people. An example is an Islamic legal text from Timbuktu. And as is typical of these texts, the margins are full of notes and commentary. So it's very much like rabbinic manuscripts from the Jewish tradition, which quote the rabbis and the different opinions, so too in the Islamic legal tradition. It turned out that not all the manuscripts have been taken to Bamako. Some manuscripts have been hidden. The major families associated with the principal mosques of Timbuktu were able to hide their manuscripts from the invaders in 2012, just as they hid them from the French in the 19th century. So we headed up there in August of 2017 to make a first visit. But we didn't have a smooth landing on that first trip to Timbuktu, which is illustrated by a sign not from Timbuktu, but actually from Beirut, which shows a graphic artist with a very dramatic understanding of what a plane landing or arriving actually looks like. And our landing in Timbuktu was kind of like that. We got there in August of 2017. We were staying at a hotel, the only one still open in Timbuktu. There you see it at the bottom of the image. And we'd been there about an hour when there was an attack on the United Nations military communications headquarters, which was a couple hundred yards from our hotel. This was a bad attack. About a dozen people were killed, both the jihadis as well as the UN troops, mostly African UN troops from other African countries. We had to hide for about 8 hours so that they didn't find us, because they like to kidnap Westerners, hold them for ransom. And we were evacuated by Swedish UN troops about 8 hours later, riding in Humvees like these to their secure camp. So when we go back to Timbuktu, we stay in the camp now. And I like to say nothing says welcome like razor wire. So this is a very high security facility. And they give us secure housing, which is protected from mortar fire. There's shelters all over the place. And when we go into town, sadly, we have to go with escorts like this, because there is such an infiltration of the town still by agents of the previous occupiers. But we nonetheless formed friendships with the Grand Imam of the Djingar Mosque. He would be the leading Muslim religious leader of Timbuktu, a wonderful, open-hearted spirit like Pope Francis or the Dalai Lama. Photographing the manuscripts of his mosque, his youngest son, Alpha, who is the librarian here with manuscripts that have been digitized, working in 2 other mosques in Timbuktu. And here you see the team working in all 3 libraries, along with my Swedish Malian colleague, Sophie Sarin, lived in Mali for many years, was married to a Malian. And this is the team that does the work of preserving the manuscripts. Most recently, we've started a project in Jenne, where Sophie lived for many years with her husband, Keita, her late husband. Jenne is the home of the most famous mud mosque of all, which is this magnificent structure. The scaffolding, which is both supporting the building inside and scaffolding on the exterior, goes out so they can stand on it when they refinish the mosque every year in a kind of local festival. When I was there last month, I had the chance to go into local villages with people like Babu on the left, who is the head of the manuscript library in Jenne. And Babu is the one who goes around negotiating with families to borrow their manuscripts so they can be photographed. So you do a lot of time sitting around. They bring out the books, you talk about them and find out what they have. And there's also the experience that I'm going to show you here in a short video clip of explaining to people what we do and why, so that they understand the project and let us join. So I'm going to let you hear a little bit of Mali right here. So there you saw Babu negotiating with people, explaining, and in the background you heard the sounds of the village. These are cultures where people live very close together. We had turned up, and so everybody came out to see what was going on. But we also had a chance while we were there to meet a couple of modern scribes. And here you can see scribes of Jenne actually writing in the traditional technique. So they're writing on boards, they're using reed pens, traditional inks. And again, they're doing this with the sounds of Jenne all around them. A madrasa across the street, the dogs, the cats, the people, every other conceivable thing happening. So that's the kind of thing that we do. Okay, so now we're going to wrap it up. What happens to all of those pictures? So we go to exotic places, we partner with locals, we take the photos. They all come back here to St. John's in Minnesota. So this is our place. Benedictine Monastery, University Prep School Publishing House, the Collegeville Institute for Ecumenical and Cultural Research, where I happen to live and where your friends, Mark Schwain and Dorothy Bass, have had many visits. And this is where we do our work. And when I show non-Minnesota audiences this, I show them the summer view and the winter view, because that's what it's like here. The winters are real, but there are also times when we get a lot done. We have a beautifully renovated library. This is the public reading room with carols for visiting scholars, a classroom in the back. But even more important than the local reading room, the physical reading room, is the online reading room. And this is where we put the manuscripts up with cataloging so that scholars can have access to them. And here also we have tools training people in paleography for Syriac, Arabic, etc. And in there, we can indicate the current status of a collection. Is it still there in situ? Has it been destroyed, relocated, missing, sold, unknown, and so on? So some stats to wrap things up. You look at the places where we worked in the Middle East, and you've got over 21,000 manuscripts photographed in those countries. You say, okay, well, how does that stack up against all those European libraries where people have done research and written the histories of all these places? So Syriac manuscripts, Ethiopic, Armenian, Christian Arabic, Western libraries, British Library, Bibliothèque Nationale de France in Paris, Staatsbibliothek in Berlin, Vatican Library, add them all up, 4 times as many digitized in our recent projects. So they're going to be amazing things discovered in those manuscripts. The Islamic manuscripts, this recent turn, Ethiopia, Jerusalem, India, Pakistan, Timbuktu, again, an enormous amount of manuscript material, and much of it relating to Islamic traditions which have not been well studied because they are regional variations or distinctive Muslim cultures. It's going to be great to see those studied in more depth. So you can find at Himmel, either in our physical reading room or online, 93,000 microfilms from the old days, over 200,000 digitized manuscripts. We already have tens of thousands of them available online. And eventually, online, you'll have more than 13 million manuscript images. And we keep capturing more every single day. So we do the work thanks to our sponsors. So a shout out to Arcadia, our largest funder in London, federal agencies, private foundations like the Mellon Foundation, the Luce Foundation, the Whiting Foundation. They truly float the boat. If you want to find out more, check us out, himmel.org, our website for the library, virtualhimmel.org with the scholarly materials. And with that, I'm going to stop my share and we can come back for some Q&A. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much. I'm going to pass this over to Tiffany Kolba for the questions. We don't have too many so far. So if you do have things that occurred to you and did not have a chance to type them in, please do that. And I will turn this over to Tiffany.
Yes, and I would like to thank Father Klump again for his talk this evening. The first question that came in says, a little knowledge is supposedly a dangerous thing. In your opinion, what's the most important cultural effect of the overly narrow exposure to manuscripts in 17th century Rome or 18th century London, for instance?
It's a very interesting question because the manuscripts that I talked about from the Syriac tradition that found their way to the Vatican or to London, almost all of them came from that monastery in Egypt, where they have been preserved by the climate. So Egypt, if you ever have to hide manuscripts, Egypt's a fantastic place to do it. Just put them in the sand because it's so dry that it will preserve them for centuries. So the climate's perfect. So they took these old manuscripts that had come from Mesopotamia, then to Egypt, they took them to Europe, and they were very important because they were ancient. So in some cases, the only surviving copy of a particular text. But it gave a skewed understanding of Syriac Christianity because it didn't illustrate the continuing intellectual tradition of manuscripts that were written all the way down to the 1980s. We have manuscripts written in the 1980s in Syriac because there are no printed copies. So this was a living tradition, not a fossilized tradition. And it wasn't only about great authors of the 5th century or the 6th century. It was about authors who composed works in Syriac right up to the present day. And so that's the imbalance that the recent work that we've been able to do is going to correct, where you get not only the very earliest things that were taken to Europe, because they like to privilege the antique, but you see the whole sweep and breadth of the tradition.
All right, our next question says, are all of the photographs of the manuscripts preserved after digitization?
So the photographs themselves are certainly preserved. We archive them. We archive the digital data. We give a copy to the owners, of course, for themselves. The manuscripts themselves remain in their original location. So we're trying to do the opposite of the colonial model, where you take it and you put it in your own library museum, which is now a very controversial topic. So they stay where they are. We can provide some assistance to get them cleaned, boxed up, better cared for. We can make partnerships with other organizations that really do that work as their primary mission. And so the preservation is both photographic and physical.
And what kinds of people are accessing and using these materials? Where are they from? What are their goals?
They're from all over. What's really interesting is a lot of the people who look at these manuscripts, Ethiopian, say, Syriac, are people who live in those regions, but they can't have access to the manuscripts in their own area because, again, they can't get into the place where they are, or there's conflict and travel is dangerous. It's easier for them to go online and look at them in our reading room than to travel to see them in their own location. Another example is some of the libraries we did in Jerusalem, these Muslim family libraries in the Old City. Most of the people who used to go to those libraries came from the West Bank, which obvious, so Palestinian area. They would come into Jerusalem, they would go to the library, they would look at the manuscripts. They can't go to Jerusalem anymore because of the Israeli separation barrier, which encloses the West Bank. So they might live a mile from the library, but it might as well be 100,000 miles. So the only access they have to the manuscripts they used to work with is on our website. So this is why these families really wanted to work with us, because it allowed them to reconnect to their previous user base, their previous audience. And then there are people from all across Europe and North America who are also using them. So it really is a global audience. And the really cool thing right now is that studying Syriac, Armenian, Ethiopic, this is kind of fashionable in the scholarship of early and medieval Christianity, because people are understanding that the very narrow Greek and Latin view we have of Christianity is false, that it was a much wider cultural spectrum. And these photographs are enabling people to really get a better sense of that incredibly diverse world.
All right. What are some of your favorite manuscripts that you've worked with for any reason?
Well, I use Syriac in my own work, as you saw with that opening little rabbit hole story about the manuscript with the name of origin in it. So it has thrilled me to work with important Syriac manuscripts in the Middle East. So that, from a scholarly perspective, that's been quite rewarding. And I've been able to find a couple of previously unknown copies of texts that were thought to survive in only one copy in the British Library. And then you find another copy written centuries later showing people actually still read the thing and used it. So that's kind of intellectually satisfying. I have developed a real love for both India and Mali culturally. In India, most of our work was with Christian communities in the Southwest. More recently, beginning to do work in North India with Muslim libraries, which are totally different culture, both very rich. But India as a place is fascinating. And Mali, not unlike it, because you have so many different ethnicities and languages, traditional cultures trying to deal with modernity. So simply in terms of really interesting places to be and larger questions about culture and the modern world, I really like those places too.
Is there an association you are associated with or collaborate with that extract manuscripts from nations in Asia?
So we work with a number of partners for the work in India, Nepal, and Pakistan. We work directly with libraries. We work with a couple of academic projects based in the United States and also in Germany who have a network and connections. And so it sort of depends case to case. So there's not like a particular association that covers all of them, but it's a series of partnerships and alliances.
If one wanted to volunteer for the missions to help look for manuscripts, how would one do so?
Well, that's not always so easy because of some of the security issues that we have to deal with. But we do have a program of travel with Himmel, where I lead groups of supporters of Himmel, members of our board, donors, and so on, to visit some of these places. So we've been to Turkey, we went to Syria before the Civil War, we've been to India, we've been to Egypt, we've been to Ethiopia, and so on. And so that is an opportunity to meet some of these cultures. And so that's something that people might look for. And just check out our website to learn more about the places that we've worked.
A student asks, how has recent digital technologies like machine learning, AI, and computer vision helped for digitizing manuscripts?
So it doesn't help so much for digitizing them, but it's really going to make a difference in reading them. So there are a lot of projects right now which are working on handwritten text recognition, so HTR. So it's like OCR we're familiar with. When you OCR a PDF of a printed or typed document, handwriting recognition for non-Western languages is a really hot field right now. And to train the machines to be able to decipher handwritten texts in complex non-Western scripts requires enormous data sets. And so we've been supplying copies of the digitized manuscripts to projects, working in the first instance on Arabic script manuscripts. And if it's Arabic script, it covers Arabic, it covers Persian, it covers Urdu, and Turkish, pre-modern Turkish, Ottoman Turkish, because they're all written in Arabic script. And that promises to be able to provide transcriptions, machine readable versions of the text in the manuscripts. And then you're just one step away from being able to do machine assisted translation. So that's very exciting. So we don't do that, that work ourselves. We're focused on the digitizing, but we do share the results of our work with these projects, which are more specifically focused on that.
Then that question asks, can you speak a bit about your own emotional response to how religions have violated sacred text and bodies in the situations you describe?
Well, it's pretty horrible. We all know that religion has been a great force for good, and it's also been a front for some very destructive and evil behavior. So what's interesting about the work we've done, say, with Muslim communities, is they look at us and they say, we have more in common with you than we do with some of our fellow Muslims who belong to the strict Wahhabi, Salafi school, Quran and nothing but Quran interpretations. And I look at them and say, well, you know, frankly, I feel like I have more in common with you than I have with some people who would identify as Christian, but manifest the same kind of intolerance that you find exemplified in other religious traditions. And so working across what seem to be very significant religious boundaries, in partnership with people who share a same kind of vision of the humanities, the importance of learning, the importance of dialogue, has been a real sort of counterweight to the emotional impact of seeing the damage that's been done. So I think that's the best way I can answer that one.
What do you do when people don't want their manuscripts digitized?
Well, there's nothing we can do. We go back and talk some more. We try to build a relationship of trust, convince them that although I'm a foreigner and an American, I'm not trying to profit from their stuff. I'm not trying to take it. Being a monk helps because I'm kind of a living, not-for-profit person. So it's a way to say, you know, our project is not for profit. It's purely research oriented. We don't make any money off this stuff. We have to find money to do the work, but sometimes the door remains closed. They're afraid that somehow they'll lose a form of control. They're afraid that people who don't fully respect their tradition will read the manuscripts inappropriately. In some cases, they've been concerned that people would Photoshop the digital images and make the text say something different. And, you know, we might say, well, these are irrational fears, but they're founded on centuries of persecution, centuries of conflict. And so we do our best, but at the end of the day, we don't always get access.
Are there any plans to scan for unseen marks on the manuscripts, such as scanning with ultraviolet light or using other technology?
So the place where this is particularly useful is palimpsests. That's probably what your questioner may be referring to, which is a manuscript which was written and then somebody washed the ink off to reuse the vellum, because that's treated animal skin, the parchment. It's valuable, you don't throw it away. So maybe you get a manuscript that's written in a language you don't use, or it's a text nobody cares for anymore, but you want to reuse it. You kind of erase it by washing the ink off, you write on top of it. And ultraviolet light and multispectral imaging allow you to read the layers underneath. And you can almost always tell that there is something underneath, even if you can't really read it. So to be honest, our work, we haven't come across any palimpsests where we're working. However, we actually have a couple of palimpsests in our own collection. We have a page of the parchment leaf, which has on top a homily in Georgian. So this is not the language spoken in Atlanta, which is its own distinctive language, I know as a Southerner. This is Georgia in the Caucasus, the modern Republic of Georgia. It's a distinctive language, has no connection with any other language that's known. And we could see on this page that somebody gave us decades ago, we don't even really know where it came from, I could see Syriac written underneath. And so we partnered with a friend who was involved with scanning the Sinai palimpsests from St. Catherine's Monastery in Sinai, which has the biggest collection of palimpsests. And so Mike Toth worked with us on that, and we found there are 3 different layers of Syriac text underneath the Georgian. And it was just fantastic. The manuscript leaf ended up out in Stanford at the Stanford Linear Accelerator or something or other, which is basically bombarding it with an incredible dose of X-rays to be able to recover the underwriting. So that's the closest we've come to that kind of thing. And all that's on our website, by the way, so check it out.
All right, I know we're at 7:05. We do have several more questions that came in, so I think that we'll read through those questions and then we'll cut it off after the ones that have already been submitted.
Okay.
All right, so questioner asks, you noted manuscript work in Ukraine, parts of southeastern Ukraine with a preponderance of Orthodox Christian groups, and Crimea with Crimea Tartars as a major group, have suffered under Russian aggression and persecution of local populations. Can you describe your manuscript work in these conflict zones?
So our work in Ukraine has been in Western Ukraine. So it's in that part of Ukraine, which is now Ukraine, at one time was Polish, at one time was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And so it's very much a border region in a different way than Eastern Ukraine is. And what makes it an interesting place to work is that although the Slavic tradition predominates, there was also a large influence of Latin and Greek because of contacts with the West. And so libraries that we've worked on in places like Lviv and new projects in Ostrog, for example, mostly Slavonic manuscripts, but also some interesting examples of Western manuscripts as well. We have not worked in Eastern Ukraine. We're very eager to do some work in Kiev, the capital. We just haven't managed to make a deal there yet. The work in the Balkans has been in Croatia and Montenegro. It's been with both Serbian tradition manuscripts in those countries, sort of scattered across the former Yugoslavia, as well more recently also working with Latin tradition manuscripts held by Catholic groups in the region. And we're really hopeful that that project post-COVID, because they've had a lot of lockdowns there, that project post-COVID will really grow.
Are there challenges in your work due to the existence of digital forgery, like the need to guarantee the authenticity of what has been digitized?
So that kind of relates back to that other one where people are afraid that the manuscript would be altered. So when we photograph something, we keep the original sort of fully uncompressed raw format image, which is kind of like a digital negative. And then the camera also generates at the same time a JPEG that you can actually work with. So it's been rendered into a readable digital format. So we keep the original raw file, And we put all of those on digital tape, and they sit down in a mountain in Utah, which is sort of in the same canyon as the mountain that has all the Mormon microfilm in it. So that's our Mad Max, apocalyptic scenario where all the stuff is. But the point of bringing that up is, we do have the original capture. And so if there were some weird, crazy thing where somebody tried to make a deal of it being manipulated, if they trust us, we can show a date stamped original image. But, thank God it hasn't come up yet.
The idea of family libraries with rare manuscripts is fascinating. Are these family heirlooms or the collections of wealthy people?
So what they tend to be, these family libraries like in Jerusalem, or we're doing a project in Lucknow, India, with the Raja of Mahmudabad. How's that as a title? The Raja of Mahmudabad. I love to say that. We did a great interview with his son recently for Himmel. That's on the Himmel YouTube channel. You might want to have a look at that. So these are families which have a tradition of scholarship, and some member of the family somewhere along the way, because they were wealthy and had access to education and learning, became a scholar and built a library. And each one of these families in Jerusalem, for example, can identify a family member who was the scholar, who developed the collection. So you might have families here and there having a manuscript or two, but these larger collections are really owing to the fact that these privileged families could support learning and had a patron within the family who was interested. And they treasure the stories of those figures and tell them. So I just interviewed Saturday one of our Palestinian partners in Jerusalem, and that interview will go live on May 20th. And he talks about why his family has these manuscripts. He's an economist, but he's a member of a family which had a scholar in the 19th century who was really concerned that manuscripts be shared. So that's how it works.
What kind of study or training should someone pursue if they want to work with Himmel or a similar organization?
Well, it depends what you want to do. If you want to be a cataloger, you got to learn languages and you have to learn the literatures. You can also go at it from the tech angle of gaining expertise in the digital humanities, issues of web access to metadata and images, which is actually pretty complicated. So we do have people on our staff who don't know any of these languages, but they're experts on the tech side. So to keep our basic normal website, but more importantly, the online reading room, which is a complicated beast. They keep that going. And of course, there are also people who work in advancement. So the people who help us in social media, publishing, marketing, the people who actually are more directly involved in raising money and cultivating relationships with foundations. That's another way. The people who don't have the particular scholarly interest but love the mission, the ways that they can get involved. But anybody can make a gift. Any gift, however small as they say, is welcome. And we really do rely on the support of generous individuals and foundations.
Is there a location or library that you long to visit in order to photograph the collection but do not have access?
Well, or access not yet. So COVID really blew up my travel plans, as you can imagine. And on my agenda was to begin to explore libraries in Central Asia. So Silk Road libraries, which have more recent Persian tradition, Islamic manuscripts, but also in some cases have vestiges of earlier traditions. And would really love to explore some of those, as well as further work in India and Pakistan, because there's a lot of stuff sitting there. So, it's on the list. I wait for travel restrictions to get lifted. I suspect the second part of 2021 and especially 2022 are going to be pretty busy years.
So a questioner says, nowadays we rarely write anything with our hands. My sons, for example, never learned to write in cursive. What do you think has been lost as a result?
Yeah, it was only just a few years ago that I learned that they're not teaching cursive anymore. As somebody who got a very traditional education in handwriting. And of course, somebody who actually used it, because that's how we used to communicate. I think it's a loss. There's a kind of niche interest now in writing by hand, people journaling by hand, writing notes by hand. We've reached the point where sending somebody a card written by hand is like a big deal because it seems so personal. Whereas, one time that was the only way you could send somebody a card because you didn't have texts and other things like that. So I think writing something by hand is a different cognitive exercise than entering something on a keyboard. And I assume students still do some handwriting of notes in addition to whatever they may record on their laptop. I certainly find that I think differently if I write things down. Now, when I'm taking notes for meetings, I rarely write it on the yellow pad like this. Most of the time I'm writing it using a stylus on an iPad, but it's handwritten. And I process things differently when I do it that way than if I enter it with a keyboard. So I hope it doesn't go away. And I hope that people come to appreciate the significance as well as the art of manuscripts written by professional scribes, like the ones you tend to see in our collections.
All right, so we are down to our final question, which is, what are the oldest manuscripts you have ever come across?
So the oldest manuscripts in our work, the work that we've been doing since 2003 when I started, things like the 5th or 6th century, like that gospel book in Diabakir that I mentioned that had that portrait of Christ, that's very old. So I think that's the oldest we've seen. Most of them come from the period 1200 to 1600. And you have to remember that in the East, printing came late. So whereas, printing started in Western Europe in the 1450s and then spread very rapidly, in many parts of the Eastern Christian and Islamic world, printing was a 19th century thing. And so manuscripts continue to be the principal medium of transmission until quite late. So that's why most of them tend to be a bit later when you look at those traditions. And when we were microfilming stuff in Europe, there certainly were also manuscripts which are quite old from that 6th, 7th century period. But there aren't a lot of Latin manuscripts that old because the climate in Europe is really bad for manuscripts. They just didn't last, they wore out. Now I do see there's one question that we didn't ask, and that's about photographic experience at Mount Athos. The answer is simple, none. They won't let us there because we're Catholic. So, there are many things I will do to photograph a manuscript, but despite my deep veneration for the Orthodox tradition, I think converting to Orthodoxy just to get at a library would be a bridge too far. But I've been to Mount Athos, and it is a fascinating place. And I'm delighted to see that they are now, with support from the Greek government, typically digitizing more of their manuscripts and sharing them. So that's exciting.
All right, so we have come to the end of our time today. So I just want to thank Father Klumpa again for joining us this evening, and then also to thank all of our participants for joining in as well. Thank you.
Take care, everybody.
Thank you. Look forward to seeing you tomorrow.
Right, you will see me.
Indeed. Thanks so much.
See you then.
Thank you to our attendees for being here as well.